Welcome, Nina Wise, to the Seekers Forum. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, Mark.
Thanks. So I want to talk to you about nonconformity. And you're one of the most devoted, dedicated artists that I've ever known. And one of the things I've always admired about you is your willingness to go your own way, to travel your own path. So I just want to start by asking, where did you get the gumption, the courage to take the road less traveled as an artist?
I think is with anything in a life, there are multifactorial elements that create one's influences, maybe. And some we know, and some we don't know, and some are like conscious, and some are very unconscious. And so for me, I certainly see a number of influences. One is I had a very eccentric grandmother. She was, and I didn't have a big family. I had one mother, as we do, although not always, and a grandfather and a grandmother and a grandfather and grandmother on the other side. But one grandmother I was particularly close to, my mother's mother. I mean, I don't know if you can even call it close. She was so eccentric. She would hitchhike to come see us. And she would always bring these chocolate covered marshmallow cookies that she would bring with her. She sewed all her own clothing. She spoke Russian, Lithuanian, Hebrew, Yiddish fluently, was a Hebrew scholar, designed all of her own clothing and just wore what she designed, which was very unusual, little jackets with little dresses. And then when she'd arrive, she lived across from the bus depot. So when she'd go across the street in El Camino, I think, in Palo Alto, get the bus, come to Los Altos where we lived, or Mountain View, and then there'd be a Safeway there where she was let off, and she would go up to people in their cars and go, "I'm an old lady, need a ride." And they would bring her to our house. She never wanted to spend a dime on anything. So she just lived, talking about an original lifestyle. She was so straight, so eccentric. So I don't know that I admired her for that, but I certainly noted it. I noted her strangeness. Mm-hmm. And there was something charming and extreme about it that, and then my mother was very original and very eccentric in her own way. She had what would be described now or diagnosed now as a personality disorder, bipolar or something like that, where she would fly into rages, and she wasn't a very nurturing mother, but she handed down a lot of instructions, to do your thing, go your own way, be ambitious. She was getting her doctorate at Stanford in early childhood education in the 50s, one of the few women to go to Stanford at that level. And she was wanting to revamp the entire educational system because she was determined that girl children were conditioned this minute they entered public school to become servile, to become stewardesses and nurses rather than doctors and pilots. And she said, it's built into the entire educational system, and I am going to revamp it. And they didn't like hearing that, but she they failed her, but she was brilliant. So, there was just a lot of eccentricity in my household. And so by then my father was gone, and so my influences were my mother and my grandmother. Mm-hmm. That said, not everyone in the family ended up particularly original. Sometimes you want to steer away from that.
Right.
But I went to Santa Cruz in the 60s, and it was the beginning of that university, and Norman O'Brown was there, and Gregory Bateson, and Ralph Abraham, the mathematician who founded KF, one of the mathematicians. People were just like, originality was the thing. Mm-hmm. And people were doing LSD we were inventing a new world. It was the 60s. So I think these confluences came together. There was an agreement of that era, don't you think, to forge your own path, create a new reality, create a new political reality, a new social reality, a new art reality, based on the principles of love and compassion and wisdom and insight that really rose up then, that I became a part of inadvertently.
And were psychedelics a big part of your coming out or your breaking through the conventional way of seeing things?
You know, what's ironic is I think in my reality, what we were doing became the conventional way of seeing things. You know, I was in a subculture where it was conventional to be postmodern, to be a rebel, to fight the war. So I thought of it as, I never thought of it as unconventional. I just felt like I was part of a movement, and it was a big movement. And yes, psychedelics fueled that movement, absolutely, because what they did is they, not just with me, but collectively, they showed us something true that no one had talked to us about. They showed us this sense of the interconnected nature of all beings. And that insight really, I think, is what fueled that revolution. You can't go to war with an enemy because there is no enemy. It's artificial. You can't worship money because money has no real value. So we were tearing down the false structures of value systems that were creating suffering on such a massive scale.
Right.
And it seemed like it would work. And psychedelics showed us the way. Absolutely. I think they fueled that whole movement.
And what about
psychedelics and marijuana too? I mean, not just psychedelics, but all kinds. And a lot of people at that point took psychedelics and then went into Buddhism, founded the whole Buddhist movement in the United States. I think they gave birth to that as well.
And I was just going to ask you, when did your own spiritual practice start, and how much did that have to do with having the courage to really walk your own path?
Again, it depends what we call spiritual practice, right? So when I first did LSD, I had a pretty classical enlightenment experience in a way where I really became awareness. And it was very clear to me that this awareness had been embodied in me, but the embodiment was a tiny bit of the awareness. And the awareness was so expansive and so real. And I understood, what they say by, beyond birth and death. It was definitely beyond birth and death, which was not entirely pleasant, because then you're going, oh no, there's no death. You can't get out of this realm of suffering. That whole notion of suffering became very clear in a huge primal kind of way. And so I didn't know what to make of it. I was friends at the time with Terence McKenna, who I met when I was 14, and my friend Kathleen Harrison and I went to, you could take a jitney from the Santa Cruz campus to the Berkeley Library. So we would take the jitney and go visit Terence and say, what do we make of this experience? And he knew what to make of it. So, and because at Santa Cruz we could do independent studies, I said, what do I do? What do I read? And he said, read the entire Union Bollingen series of 13 volumes. So I went to my professors and I said, okay, I'm reading the entire Bollingen series. And they went, okay. And then I'd go to Terence and he goes, read about Gnosticism. Here's your reading list. And they have a really interesting worldview about the soul trapped in the body. And I went, yes, it's true. That's what's happening. And I didn't get into a formal meditation practice until later, but I was 18 then, 19, and trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. And then I got a degree in religious studies and the aesthetics of movement, religious studies and dance, essentially. They wouldn't let me call it dance. It was a big conundrum because it was a very new dance department at Santa Cruz, and they were afraid I was too eccentric. It would jeopardize the, what do they call it, accreditation of the department. So we sat for a long time, and my professors and I going, well, what can we call it? It's like dance, but isn't dance, and isn't that word? So we call it the aesthetics of movement. But basically, I studied the New Testament, the Old Testament, Jung, the Gnostics, trying to make sense of what I had seen. Wow. But at the time, nobody said, oh, Buddhism will explain this to you. I don't know why. Nobody took me in that direction. I had friends or distant friends who were, but I didn't know that Buddhism held so much articulation of what my experience had been until later.
Were you aware as a young person of having spiritual hunger, a hunger for connection to the great beyond, and a sense of deep questioning about your identity? Was that something that was a driving force for you as a young person?
I'd say, again, ironically or paradoxically, almost the opposite. That I remember, we were raised Jewish. We were my father was born in Danzig, escaped the Nazis. Most of my family were killed in the camps. And my mother was a Hebrew. She took her at Stanford, when you were getting a doctorate, you had to be fluent in a couple of languages, and she was fluent in Hebrew. And her father was a very famous rabbinical scholar, trained a lot of rabbis who became very, very famous rabbis in the United States. And my grandmother was also a scholar, Hebrew scholar, read the Talmud and taught, prepared me for my bat mitzvah. So we have this very strong Jewish influence. And mostly the way it was expressed was not in terms of a God or a great beyond, but social justice. Like for Passover, my mother would always say, we always have to identify with the oppressed because we were oppressed. And she was an activist. She was a civil rights activist. She was a voting rights activist. And that in Judaism seemed very, very integrated to me. That was always what we were taught, and it made sense. But I remember going to Reform Synagogue as a child. I don't know what your experience was, and just I couldn't stand it because it didn't make any sense to me. And I was thinking, no, there's something else, and this isn't it. And how can all these people be sitting here for hours doing this? And then I went to the conservative and the Orthodox, and it just wasn't adding up to me. I was so uncomfortable. So something in me, it's not that I knew I was seeking it, but I knew where it wasn't.
Right. So let's just circle back a little bit to becoming an artist and realizing that was your path. Can we talk about how did you make the choice to say, this is my life, this is what I'm going to do with my career, with my aspiration? Talk about the challenges, particularly also being a woman in the arts. How was it for you, kind of getting the courage to do this?
I think the only way I had, looking back, I would ask myself the same question. Like, what were you thinking? You're going to become an avant-garde performance artist before performance art is even created, and try and make a living doing that, in this culture, which is a capitalist culture. What were you thinking? That's insane. Your life, what were you thinking? So the only answer is I wasn't thinking. I declared my major like a month before I graduated. I just did what I wanted to do. I did what interested me. And it turned out that what interested me was physicality. Dance really interested me, and kind of pursuing this insight about this enlightenment experience that I'd had. That's what drew me. And I just went towards what drew me, because you could then, it was very inexpensive to live. And I went to Santa Cruz, where you could do what you wanted to do. There was a lot of encouragement for students to create their own path. So it was just again a confluence of factors that I never thought about. I just went, oh, you just kind of make art. At that time, it's so different now. I never got an MFA. And then, but also another factor is I really had a pretty, the word traumatic is overused, but I think it qualifies in this case, pretty traumatic childhood. My mother was suicidal. She was very mean to me, and it was very unsafe in my home. But I took dance classes, and there was something about being in the body and moving, where your focus is all on your physicality. The turnout. Are you lifting the arm from the muscles under the arm, and is the finger relaxed, and is the energy extending beyond the extension of the arm? And when you move your head, can you feel it, and how your feet are planted on the ground? Where that became a refuge, even though it was hard, and I wasn't necessarily that good at it. I knew how to, I became good at it, as I think many traumatized people maybe are. You either leave your body or you go into it, right? As a response to trauma. If you go, and for the people who go into it, it's really a refuge, because it's no thought, it's sensation. You're relying on sensation as your primary focus. So my mother took me to dance. I think that was also a big influence. It was valued in a certain way by her. So I just took a lot of dance classes. And it was at a time when postmodern dance was just being born. So people were starting to integrate film. For my graduation at Santa Cruz, I made a performance piece, and I gathered these students together who were dancers, and I did choreography, and I filmed. I did a piece to Lay Lady Lay, and I went around town. I was how old was I then? 17, like 21. I went 22. I went around town filming all my friends' beds, and I wouldn't announce myself. So all states of array and disarray. And so this film was going, and we were doing the rolling around on top of each other. And that was part of my my focus, because it was fun. I mean, who doesn't enjoy making art? But I didn't think about it. I didn't think, oh, I am an artist. I never thought about it.
When did that start to dawn on you, that there were consequences to your
very recently? I have friends who go, am I an artist? Am I not an artist? And reading books about how to be an artist. And I thought, no, you're not an artist. You make art. If you worry about if you're an artist or not, you're just going down the wrong track. How do you be an artist? How do artists be artists? I mean, it's interesting to read how writers write, right? Do you wake up in the morning and do your 3 hours then, and then not write in the afternoon? Or I remember we were at a dinner party, and there were different writers, and they were all talking about their different schedules. That was fascinating. But we weren't going, well, are you a writer or not a writer? Do you think of yourself as a writer? Because it's not the identity, it's the act.
Yeah. And that says that to me goes to the point of what I'm saying, which is that really nonconformity is about acting. It's about doing the thing rather than what role am I fitting myself into? How does that role correspond to other roles? It's really about staying with desire, isn't it? It's about staying with that impulse to express.
The impulse to express. And I think we all have it. And I think what happens in our culture is that when you're a child, You are, given a little easel with your paints and finger paints and little pianos, and you're kind of forced into that. You're not forced, but you're given these objects of creation. You write stories. Everybody puts your pictures on the wall. Go, oh, look at my picture. Look at my son's picture. You make pottery. You make little ashtrays. Not out used to be ashtrays. You make little whatever for your parents, and clay. Right? You sing. You play instruments. You are like given all of that to do. They stick you in a corner and go make art, make art, make art, make art. And then you turn what, 10, 11, 12? They go, okay, stop. Like,
yeah.
Stop. Now you have to do something else. And everybody goes along with it because you're a child. You don't know that wasn't just for that age, that you can keep making art. So when people ask me, when I started, I asked them when they stopped.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't ever start. I just didn't stop. I mean, you start when you're 3 years old, right? And but people stop.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of the costs of this non-choice to be an artist, can we talk a little bit about how you balance out the adversity, the difficulties of it, the impossible parts of being a non-conformist and an artist in this kind of culture? How do you move through difficult times when there's self-doubt or financially, whatever the obstacles happen to be? Where do you find your strength?
It's an interesting question, because I think until the pandemic, I was quite resilient. And these last 3 years, kind of coinciding with being older, has been rocky for me. I realized not rocky entirely on a financial level, but psychologically. I was talking to an artist friend last night who came over. I'm in New York now, staying in a big loft in New York, and where I have a lot of artist friends. And we were talking about the unidentified cost still of these past few years. And for me, it really bit into my confidence in a way that I don't know that I have ever felt before. So I'm continuing to work, but it's so subtle. It may be not so subtle, but there's an ache maybe that I don't think I've experienced before. So there are many factors that you're talking about. One of the factors for me that was so important is that when I started making art, and I have peers who all started at the same time, and they're wonderful artists still, not all of them, some of them have stopped. It was easy. There was funding. You could get grants to do art. So we formed a nonprofit. We would write grants and we would get them and we would make our art. We could I lived in a dance studio in downtown Oakland. We called it the Natural Dance Studio. We were the first people to bring Contact Improv to Northern California. Steve Paxton came out. Deborah Hay came out and did her circle dances. I mean, it was just easy. I lived with 4 or 5 other people. It was 2 floors of dance studio with bedrooms and kitchen. And we paid $50 a month each for rent. Like now that might be like $250. It was, and we had food co-ops. So we would each spend $30 a week on food and have these go pick up our food from the farms. And so there was funding. We had studios, and it was easy, really inexpensive to live. And the other thing, Mark, was so interesting is there was such an anti-capitalist sensibility. So I remember discovering that I had a friend who had a Porsche, and she kept it covered up. She would drive it. Like any kind of ostentatious consumption was so looked down upon. You lived collectively, you shared your resources. We didn't call it socialism. We just knew that that where value lay was not in collecting huge amounts of money. It was so taboo. So that allowed me to, it didn't require the kind of courage it might require now, where you're just going, how can I possibly function in, I was looking at what a bagel and lox cost $16, $20. Like,
Right.
how do you do that in rents? And people still do it. Okay, so that was my formative time. And then, but how do I manage the difficulties? There are three levels of difficulty. One difficulty is when you're making art and you run into obstacles. So when I was working on this big piece I did about Kepler and the planetariums, there were a lot of obstacles. His life, Kepler's life too, had a lot of obstacles. And often they say that happens, like you're going to live the same life as the main character of your play, so be careful who you choose. But it was just like, that piece was spectacular. It was a big success artistically, but the obstacles were consistent, because planetariums don't do theater, and so the software isn't designed to have lighting cues, and they don't know how to do ticketing, and that was madness. But it worked, and I think what got me through it is, number one, I had help. I could go to other people and go, can you come to this meeting with me, because I'm a woman, and the way I'm being talked to, I think they won't talk to you because you're a man. So will you come to this meeting with me?
Wow.
And you do the talking, and I'll just sit here and smile and, bat my eyelashes.
And this is only 10 years ago. We're not talking about back in the 60s or something. Yeah.
Or we did a big piece, Lauren Elder and I, years ago, in the parking garage of the Oakland Museum, with using real live cars and actors and music, and we brought in bleachers. We had to rent parking spaces for our sets. They wouldn't just let us leave them there. And when we went in for our first rehearsal, we hadn't anticipated that the sound really echoes in a parking garage, because the ceilings are low, it's all concrete. So the night before the show, we're like standing on these step ladders trying to paste egg crates to the ceiling to deaden the sound. And it was very DIY. And so there's artistic obstacles. And I think basically just to getting help, either people to talk to or somebody to be a bit of a cheerleader. But then I think the main obstacle I have right now is, and I don't know how to resolve it, is how can I have a very, I'm older now, so I know my time is limited. We never know how much ever, but when you're older that you don't have that much time left. And I have a lot of projects. So how do I have enough financial support to do my projects and not have to focus on all the marketing and fundraising? And I think that's very difficult. And, I think most obstacles you overcome just by going one step at a time and not buying into one's own narrative around, I can't do this, it's too hard. But I think any artist, I was going to say worth their salt, but that's such a judgment. But maybe I'll say it anyway. If you're going to make art, you have to have the courage to follow your own sensibility. And you can't be thinking about, will this be accepted? Will it not be accepted? People do. But I think if you teach this to everybody. If there's an inner impulse, and either if you're doing a drawing or you are writing something down or you're making music, you either like what you do, it feels right, or it doesn't to you. And when it feels right, you have to keep following what feels right. And eventually, I think the artists who do that, their audiences come along, or they don't, right? I mean, we have stories and stories and stories, the Van Gogh stories of people dying, and then everybody loves them 100 years later. But as an artist, that's what you're doing. You're making art from what wants to be said in whatever format that is. And I think
go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Well, and the art itself will, not that you don't want feedback from friends and colleagues, you choose your people to write, say that sentence doesn't work or this story doesn't line up. But you keep listening to your own heart's inclination, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And I think really what you're asking me, there's really just one answer, even though there are all these parts, we could go in all these directions, is, how do you have the strength to follow your own heart's inclination? But I don't think there's an answer. I think you just do.
Mm-hmm.
If you sort of don't have a choice as an artist, because what else are you going to do? And
So
for me, I think it was my only way to, I think if I hadn't made art, I would be really messed up psychologically. That it's healing to focus on it.
How old were you when you felt like you had really come into your own as an artist, that you had found you had a voice, you had a language, you had a vernacular that was unique to you? What age were you when you felt like, there I am?
Again, many answers to this question. I was making art during the 80s. We had a fair amount of support. And the last big piece I did in that era was an opera about a group of people going to outer space. And I don't know and it was very cool. We had at the time, already computer generated, not generated, but multi-computers running imagery on multiple screens. I was working with a team of composers, really interesting set design. We workshopped it. We were on the brink of getting a big grant from the NEA when everything collapsed. That was everything collapsed for art funding. And I don't know that I felt, I have my voice, I don't have my voice. I just made work that I was really interested in and had a fair amount of confidence in it. It had done pretty well. We were getting funding and just wasn't an issue then. We were living inexpensively, getting funding, had studios, made our art. Mm-hmm. So it's not like I felt like, I have my voice, I don't have my voice. I just kind of did what I felt like doing performatively. Mm-hmm. And I always had collaborators. And then all the funding collapsed. Mm-hmm. So I was thrown for a loop for about a year because I was doing work that required in money. And I needed, I had producers or program managers and grant writers, and it all came apart. Mm-hmm. So then I just sat myself down in my studio one day and I went, okay, what can you do with no money? You have a body. If you want, you can have one microphone and one light. What can you do? And I started inventing this form that has become one of my signature forms. And I went into the studio and I just started, I'd been trained as an improviser. That was had been some of my original performative work. And I just kind of went back to what I knew how to do with my body and my voice and came up with a new form, really. And then there was a big conference on Joseph Campbell and mythology, and Rollo May was to present. It was a day-long conference in San Francisco, 800 people, I think. Rollo May was to present, and I got a call that he'd taken ill, was in the hospital. Would I substitute? And I went, okay. I'd never done this form before.
Really?
And I went, okay. And I went out on stage, and there were all these famous presenters before and after me. And I did this, and in the back room, all these famous presenters, they paid me no mind. I was not considered one of the stars of this event. And I went out and I did this form it was solo, it was narrative, it integrated what the other speakers had talked about. with autobiographical material and about mythology. Faust, he was going to talk about Faust. So I talked about the myth of the mall. The myth of consumption is our contemporary, Faustian bargain. And I got this huge standing ovation. And everyone was just, oh my God, what was that? So that luckily it went well. That kind of launched this newer form for me. And, in a way that then became something I developed and definitely found a voice. But I was older then, maybe in my 30s, mid 30s. Yeah.
And it's not accidental that it came directly out of a limitation. It came directly out of having to adapt to something that you couldn't do and having to find something else. And so you really came to what's unique and original that you do. Not that all of your work isn't original, but there is a particular kind of thing you do that I've never seen anyone else do.
Right.
And like the work you do around what just happened, which is such a great, I don't know, what do you call it? Do you call that it's not a show, it's a concept. Can you talk about what just happened, that the performances you do?
Yeah, what just happened is a form of autobiographical narrative, performative work that's improvised, based on the last 24 hours of my life. And Chekhov once said that, is it Chekhov? I think so, that anybody should be able to write a novel from the last 24 hours, that there's enough narrative in there.
Yeah.
Because as I teach my students, the present contains the past. So it's not necessarily only about what happened, but you can pick anything up and talk about, like this is a New Yorker cartoon, this cup, which I really love. It's a man lying on a couch with tears coming down his face. I don't know if you can see it. And with the dog sitting in a chair. And the dog says, well, I think you're wonderful. And so, the New Yorker, that could lead me into talking about my experience reading New Yorkers and subscribing and having them pile up and not getting to them and torturing me in the corner of the house for years until I finally unsubscribed, but I still kept a few and hoping I might read an article or two, or articles I read in it, or my experiences in New York, that anything can lead to anything. So I do these performances based on the last 24 hours of my life. And kind of what happens in our lives is we have all kinds of experiences and we don't pay attention to them. They lose significance, not because they don't have it, but because we don't notice, we don't value them. So by writing about recent experiences, like morning pages in a way, but morning pages can be so psychological. This is really like mining, might be too aggressive a word even, but paying attention to the meaningfulness of our daily experience, which has been robbed from us because of all the input we have from, like we hear about all the tweets and all the news stations and all the things in the inbox, read this thing, listen to that podcast. I mean, our own lives can feel very impoverished in relationship to that level of input. And so when we talk about our experiences and our relationships and our insights, our lives start to have more meaning and more value.
What's it's so brilliant to see on stage, and what always impresses me also is how it's a seamless synthesis between spiritual practice and improv. And it seems to me you're bringing the Dharma, into improv through this particular kind of creation that, as you say, it forces people to pay more attention to their experience and to appreciate and know what's going on for them. So you're very good, I know, with helping students to find their own voice, their own originality, their own creativity. When someone comes to you, Nina, and says, I have something to say, but I don't know what it is, Where do you go with that person?
Um, I don't know that I've had so much of that experience, although I have. But so the way I'm currently teaching, and I'm teaching writing because of the pandemic, I went from teaching improv in studios where we could meet live together to, because of you encouraged me to do this. And I've been teaching storytelling for decades, really, but I hadn't said, okay, I'm going to teach writing, even though I am a writer and I do publish work. So what I focus on a lot are craft issues. So when writing has certain elements of the craft, that characters, action, plot, how you work with time, past, present, future, how those all intersperse with each other, setting. And a lot of times when people come to write these days, they forget that they're elements of the craft that can really make their writing stronger. So and then finding what I call finding the heat or finding the heart of the matter. Like, what is it that is concerning you right now that you want to express? And everybody has something generally, or multiple things that are really up for them. And I often encourage people to take a walk, because when we work with a cross-lateral movement, the mind will operate in a different way. It stimulates a different part of the brain. We get more intelligent in a way, and things will surface. Whereas if we're sitting at a desk trying to figure it out, although we do that, how people do free writes, like what's up for you, and don't worry about how well you're writing. Just get it out on paper and see what's there. And then I teach things like each week we'll focus on a different craft element. But what happens, it's so interesting, is that the subconscious will shine through things like a setting. I just did this exercise yesterday, day before, that I had never done before with I have a new 4-month group starting. So 4 months is a big commitment. And so the first class, I said, I'm going to have you free write about why you're taking this class, right? So I don't always do in my shorter classes, but for 4 months, it's good to get that ground. Like, why are you here? And what do you want? And what are you afraid of? And just let it go, let it rip. I don't care if it's even full sentences. But I had them intersperse where they were. So they would write, I'm here because I really want to learn how to write. And I find that self-expression makes me feel better during the day. I'm sitting by a bank of 20-foot windows looking out onto a blue sky, but it's 37 degrees outside. I write because I'm here because, I want to be with other people and have a weekly commitment. I'm sleeping in a bed in a dark room with the Empire State Building out the window. And subtly, by including where they were in a very unpredictable way, this meaning would emerge that informed why they were writing. It's quite magical. It was crazy, because you're letting the subconscious work through images. And the images, it's like sort of psychoanalysis, right? The images can come through in a way, and you go, oh my God, look at that. That's really why I'm here, or what's up for me, or.
So interesting.
That was really.
It's such an unusual way of finding voice, people tend to go in a more psychological direction, instead of what you're talking about, craft, setting, really get a placement in the universe. It's embodiment. So you're saying that it starts with where are you embodied, and that really is what informs the originality.
Yeah, and in the power of the narrative as well. And people are having I just finished an 8-week course, and I had an older psychotherapist, who'd been practicing psychotherapy for many, many years. He could not believe the psychological insights he was having, but it was all through craft elements that gave rise to these. He was just like amazed at what was happening to him, as are many of the people in the group. That you could write about setting, and what it will tell you about your state of mind is as articulate as if you're just talking about your state of mind. So our reality, our emotions, our psychological conditioning is reflected through how we tell a story, even if you're not telling what you think is a psychological story.
Right. Or writing specifically about your state of mind, about that. And sometimes you go deeper when you come in sideways that way, don't you? Things reveal themselves that you never expect, or the person never expected to be revealed, because you're not so on the nose with things.
Yeah. And it allows the subconscious to step forward, and the subconscious is always correct. Subconscious it holds so much information and truth about ourselves. And sometimes you won't even know that you wrote it until you read it. I have my students read aloud to each other what they wrote in the session. And then when they read it aloud, they go, oh my God, that happens to me all the time. It's like, I have them, when they end a piece of writing, end with an image rather than an idea. And these ending images are just like carry so much insight, often, not always, but yeah.
Let me ask you, I have two more questions for you. The first is about situation and story. It's something I work with people around all the time, is the situation, what happened is not the story. The story is what mattered. How did you respond to it? How did it figure into your larger journey? You managed to focus on situation and get to depth with people. How do you do that?
Well, I don't do it. What I found in my life, and I'm really a strong believer in this, is that if you follow the need of the craft, it will take you to the profound insight. That if what you're writing isn't working, it will reflect, how do I say this? It reflects that your understanding isn't working, isn't thorough, isn't complete. Like if somebody's writing a story and it's all about how horrible this other person is, it won't work as a piece of writing, because what happens is the reader will not like the writer. Like if you start, when the writer's going on about blame, it's not good writing, because we have this internal system that prefers truth. And truth and blame are not don't go together, because two people in conflict are in conflict because of conditioning on both sides that are bumping up against each other. And it doesn't mean you forgive the rapist or anything, but you see the conditions that led the abuser to that situation. So just to say, oh, my mother hit me, it doesn't work. But if you say, my mother was standing across the room in her bathrobe and her hair was disheveled and she hadn't brushed her teeth and you could smell the breath across the room, and she was holding a teapot in her hand and she gave me that look. And I remembered the milk bottle flying across the room and smashing against the wall and leaving desiccated milk and the grooves on the paneling. And I watched her hold that teapot. Then that's the writing. If I say I was a little girl and feeling terrified in the corner and I was afraid of my mother, that's not going to work as well. Because what you want to create is, if you just say what happened, then your reader will experience your terror and your fear. Right? You don't have to tell them how you felt. You need to create a situation, and you do this so brilliantly in your memoir, of what your experience was as a child. If you're writing about that, you tell the story using your sense details, like what happened, not what you made of what happened. And then the reader will be able to make themselves the same thing you made of what happened.
Right.
And interestingly enough, that tends to free people. And I think there are a number of reasons why. One is when you can tell a coherent narrative, all that research, the neuroscientific research now, when you can tell a coherent narrative of a difficult experience, the damage that was done to the brain circuits when trauma happens, it starts to be repaired. Literally, you create new neural networks that were severed. So there's a neurological effect to telling a coherent story. That's crazy. Like that a story will change your brain physiologically. But I find also what it does is it gives you agency over that story. Like often when we have trauma, we have no agency. But when we are writers, we have agency. And that sense of I'm in control of this narrative is also very healing.
So it goes both ways. So it heals you as a writer or as an artist. And it also makes space for the audience or the reader to have their version of that experience through the work.
Yeah. I don't know if I fully answered your question, though.
You did. No, you absolutely did. And I want to ask you one last question, which is around spiritual practice. You're a Dharma teacher as well as a performance artist and an author. How do you bring your Dharmic wisdom, your awareness of spiritual wisdom to how you approach your work with other people and your own creative work? How does it impact your delivery, for want of a better word?
Well, I'll start with me as an artist. For a long time, I didn't really talk about being a spiritual teacher or having a spiritual practice. I kept them quite separate in terms of how I was public about it. It was much more dangerous to say that you meditated. Remember, you couldn't say that aloud a long time ago. You would be considered, or did yoga, you would be considered really kind of, there was a lot of shame involved in it. You'd be looked down upon. I don't know if you remember that era.
Particularly in the artistic community, or are you talking about
any
the general culture?
The general culture. People caught you sitting with your eyes closed and your hands like this. They would not want to sit next to you on the airplane. I had that experience.
Really?
I was stretching once in an airport a little bit, not wildly, and I got on the airplane because, it was a long wait for the airplane, and I was moving a little bit and just stretching subtly, not throwing myself around the lobby. And I sat down on the airplane. And this man sat next to me, kind of heavy set man, and had a couple of whiskeys. And then he just looked at me. So I was really praying I wouldn't sit next to you. So, we were all pretty quiet about it for a long time. And then it got to be the thing. That's the thing about being avant-garde. You start something and at the time, it's not so great, but then everybody buys into it at some point because you're onto something. So then I became more public about it, that I did, practice Buddhism and blah, blah. But I don't think I ever, although now I am, went, I'm doing a piece. How do I say this? You just do it naturally because your Buddhism informs you, or your spiritual practice, whatever it is, informs you. And then you start making work that's informed by that insight. It's not like you decide. Although now I'm working on a musical album of chants. So that's very specific. But like when I did Kepler, the reason I did it is because I felt like in contemporary science, the notion of this interconnected nature of reality and this kind of awareness that can exist even in a rock used to be part of scientific worldview, and it's not anymore. Ralph Abraham called it when science lost the soul. And so I wanted to see if in the heart of a scientific institution, I could bring that narrative back in. And the way I could do that was talking about Kepler. I didn't have to say, I believe this. I could use him as a historical voice who came up with the 3 laws of planetary motion, and talk about his vision of the interconnected nature of the universe with these enormous visuals in the heart of the scientific academy, and have people from NASA come and be weeping. And, so, but it was that what I was after. I was using Kepler in a way, which is a great story. It's a great life story. It's terribly dramatic and theatrical and interesting, but it became a vehicle for meaning that I was after. In terms of the thing about autobiographical work is it can seem, if people don't do it well, very self-indulgent or narcissistic, because it's not, I never think that's its intention, is that just that people aren't doing it well. Their craft isn't good enough. That when you really deepen into autobiographical work or biographical work with Emerson that you're doing, when you talk about your own life with the intention of, for yourself, not just for anyone else necessarily, of what we might call wisdom and compassion and insight, rather than revenge, which is a lot of what people do. That's Dharma, that's spirituality. And it's embedded in the craft. The craft kind of demands that of you, I think. So, I'm not being very articulate here, but Edward St. Aubin has been a good friend of mine. We would have these long, long talks about this. But when he was writing about being raped by his father in a novelistic way, autofiction, we were talking about, like, how do you do that? And what's so notable about his work, and what he and I talked about a lot, is that when you're working with hot traumatic issues, you completely refrain from self-pity, and you speak with a cooler voice. This is what happened. And when that occurs, that combo of, even though it's a traumatic event, you just talk about what happened. I flew out of my body. I was looking down at the room from above, rather than this is such a horrible experience. That something is freed in the system, because that's where the coherent narrative lies. And that's also dharmic, because it's your meditation is all about observing reality, right? And seeing what is and resting in awareness as what is happens, and seeing it really clearly. So that's one aspect. I lead people through a lot of guided visualizations, and just to see yourself. When we do character work, close your eyes, feel your breath, empty the mind, see yourself in a scene with another person. What are they wearing? Where are they? What is their yearning? What do they long for? What do you long for? What are you wearing? Where's the light coming from? And insights arise. You have to, and I don't know, you have to know that that's what you're yearning for as an artist, is to work at that level. You know what I mean?
I do. And I think that's what we're doing as human beings, isn't it?
That's right.
We're learning to embody our experience and also cultivate a perspective on the experience, so that we're not completely identified,
right,
with our neuroses and our crazy minds. And that's what you do so brilliantly, is help to liberate people from the self-consciousness of victims, the victim story, or just being so in it that it becomes a narcissistic kind of exercise. You teach people to expand their awareness. So it really is, it's Dharma instruction at the same time that it's really brilliant writing and performance instruction, which is what makes you so unique. So, Nina, I'm so happy to talk to you.